it's not a matter there's a type of progressive disposition that demands change to happen immediately, and they are not, comfortable with incremental change. And they're a lot of their point of view is based on maintaining a certain mentality of aggravated grievance, and they will not relent, and they I think can become somewhat detrimental to the progressive process.
If their urgency and their aggravated grievance convince them that if they can't have what they want, they're not going to help,
right,
that's problematic.
Right.
I don't mind in fact, we should celebrate those who call out the problems, those
Sure.
who are willing to challenge the norm, and
right.
those who are willing to declare what should be. But if you don't get your way, if you don't get what you want, that's a tantrum. And that's not helpful to anyone, especially to those
right.
who remain mired in this, or more importantly, oppressed by these changes. I want more. I have a vision of the best.
Yeah.
But I don't have the luxury of saying I don't want anything if I can't have everything. Because my life, my siblings' lives, my nieces and nephews' lives, my parents' lives are detrimentally affected if what I do is exempt myself from the process if I don't get what I want.
And I just, like, in reading the book and also in seeing what's happening now, that it becomes like outside of seeking justice and demanding the criminal justice system to work in relation to these murderous cops, that ultimately all the answers to making the system work correctly, come down to what you're promoting. That it really comes down to voting, and it's not going to be an overnight process. And in order for it to work, there needs to be a level of education and access that has to be created. That could be who knows how long it will take, but that is the way it works. To keep people in a culture that are either compromised by poverty or just basic, distraction, to sort of, keep moving in the direction that will make your system function and work. That's the real challenge, right?
It is. And part of this is we are used to this notion of instant change because that's what we see on television. By the end of the hour, the culprit is caught, the problems are fixed, unless you're watching, a melodrama, in
right.
which case the goal is the melodrama. But we get trained to believe it can work that way, even more because we see that for some it does work that way. My responsibility in the space where I enter is that we have to be honest with people, because politicians feed into that narrative. They declare that if you elect me, I will do these 10 things, knowing good and well they can't do 9 of them. And they might get a bill on one that may go into committee. But that's the way the system works. And so my approach is, I'm not going to promise you a fix. I'm going to promise you an effort and tell you what I need you to do to make the fix more likely.
Right.
Because the extent to which our elected representatives at any level of government aren't held accountable after the vote, then the vote has diminished power. And so my approach is to say, number one, this is complex. This is tedious. It is unlikely to work. I mean, I used to get into trouble when I was minority leader because I would tell, I would make this joke, minority leader means it's Latin for lose well.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't going to get the things I wanted. And my job was mostly to stop stupid or at least slow it down.
Yeah.
And if I told you I was going to fix everything, knowing that I only had 60 votes out of 180, either I couldn't do math or I was lying to you. And so our responsibility is to make sure people understand the complexity of the system, that a President Obama cannot deliver legislative change if we don't vote in a 2010 election that then turns the Congress into a conservative frat house. That we cannot have the Supreme Court that we need if we do not hold the Senate in 2016. We have all of these pieces that we pretend operate in isolation, but we also pretend that by the end of the episode, the answer is there. And that's just not how government works. It's not how politics works. It's not how life works. But we have the responsibility as elected leaders, or those who would like to be elected, to actually explain it and to make sure that we diminish the amount of power people think we hold by explaining to them that their power is greater than ours, because the way they can motivate us to get it done is to either hire us or fire us, and that happens by voting. I mean, you used the word earlier. People are overwhelmed by what happens. And the more oppressive the system, the more realistic it seems that this is going to continue to exist. People can believe that you can eliminate a small scratch, but a gash, a wound, they believe less that you can actually solve that problem. And so that problem festers. And so I think it's the baseline issue of not knowing how things work, but it's also the imagination that it can be better. And that's part of the effectiveness of oppression. It's the effectiveness of voter suppression. It's the effectiveness of a criminal justice system that locks up so many people. It is this constancy of behavior that makes you believe this is all there is, and that there's really no use in fighting.
And then you have that type of state, which is sort of what we live in for most people.
Yes.
The thing that's frightening me now more than a lot of things is even fairly intelligent people's inability to see themselves as part of a bigger community, as part of a citizenship, as part of that. There's a selfishness and a self-centeredness now that's encouraged and seemingly malignant in that, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but a lot of people have just decided that it doesn't exist anymore. And I don't know what that says about Americans, but literally they're trying to will it away. And that is a type of delusional behavior and lack of respect for the sort of general well-being of the populace that I don't quite understand. Do you?
I understand it. I don't like it. I mean, but we've always had these people in our society. In fact, one of them currently serves as the head of our country.
Yeah.
And the extent to which delusion is reinforced by others who have the shared delusion.
Yeah.
Your sense of, invincibility becomes stronger, but more importantly, to your underlying point, your sense of communal obligation gets eroded.
Yeah.
And in a nation where so many pockets of our population, so many segments are actually diminished in word and in deed, we shouldn't be surprised that people will suddenly think, well, they're really not valuable. We use these terms to disconnect and dehumanize, and then we're surprised by people being disconnected and treating people with lack of humanity. Right. And so it's what we've built, in part because we've had leaders, particularly in the last 4 years, but I would say over the last 40 years, that have done their level best to diminish our faith. I mean, one thing I wrote an afterword for Our Time Is Now. Mm-hmm. And I talk about the fact that for 40 years, we have heard Republicans say that, bureaucrats are useless and that we should shrink government small enough to drown it in a bathtub.
Right.
They've, incarcerated, and they've used language to separate us and divide us, but also to diminish our faith in science. We no longer trust the very thing that will save our lives. We cannot then be surprised that in the midst of a pandemic, the people who've been told for 40 years that government can't help, that science isn't real, and that it's somebody else's fault, that they don't trust science, they don't trust government, and they don't think they have any responsibility to others.
And in terms of where we're at now, which is scary, and it's hard to really determine what happens next on any given day. But I can understand that there are reasons to be hopeful, and there is things going on. People are waking up, and people are fighting for the good fight. But is there any part of your brain that fears authoritarianism in a real way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are living in the early stages of an authoritarian regime.
Yeah.
And it begins with a populace, usually, who uses coarse language and grandiosity to attract attention and distract from their lack of moral core. It then gets transmuted into the domination of a certain form of communication so that they can discredit every other communication that doesn't reinforce their message. You then see them take over institutions, or if they can't take them over, like the judiciary, they then actually try to diminish faith in the other organizations, like the media, like inspectors general. Mm-hmm. And then their end game is to stop the elections. And they stop the elections not by declaring authoritarian rule. If you look at Erdogan in Turkey, if you look at Indira Modi in India, if you look at Jair Bolsonaro, these are all authoritarian populists who are in various stages of this. But if you want to look at who's gotten it all done, look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has essentially now become the strong man, who's taken over what used to be a thriving democracy. And what Trump has done is every stage of the populist playbook. His only remaining stage is to discredit our elections, either by denying people the right to vote, which is what he's doing by saying that we shouldn't be able to have mail-in ballots, even though he and his entourage use them. In fact, may have fraudulently used them.
Yeah.
But they also then say it's fraudulent if anyone else tries to use it. Oh, and let's dismantle the U.S. Postal Service. So just in case the fraud accusation doesn't work, we take the money away. Right. So yeah, we are in the end game of early stage authoritarianism that's being suborned by the U.S. Senate, because the other thing an authoritarian populist does is they convince their political adjutants that their only survival is to forget who they are and join in this diminution of who we are as a nation.
Be a loyalist over being a representative.
Exactly.
Well, that's terrifying.
Yeah. But the thing is, and the reason for the overly hopeful title is that we can still fix it.
Yeah.
I mean, democracy is fragile, but it can also be resilient if the people within it remember who they are. We had a civil war that was fought over whether Blacks were humans. And that ripped us apart because not everyone fighting agreed. Not even the people fighting for Black humanity actually believed it to be so, but they believed in the ideal of the democracy enough that they were willing to suspend their disbelief. And even if the outcome was good, they were willing to do it. Of course, you had redemption, which came after Reconstruction, when they were like, oops, never mind. But even in that moment, in that fraught moment, we had a fragile democracy that was torn asunder, but we had folks willing to fight to build it back. And even though it was built back on shaky ground, It was built back firmer than it had been before that war.
Now, I have to assume that when you were growing up, this was not the plan.
Oh, no.
How many kids in your family?
I'm the second of 6 children.
Where'd you grow up?
So I was born in Wisconsin, but we all grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi.
Okay, so big family, Gulfport, Mississippi. What did your folks do?
My mom was a college librarian who made less money sometimes than the janitor who cleaned the college.
Right.
And my dad was a shipyard worker. He was dyslexic, and so after college, he just couldn't get an office job. And so he ended up working as a dock worker and a shipyard worker.
And that's what they did their whole life?
So they did that until the age of 40.
Yeah.
When they were both called into the ministry and became United Methodist ministers. So we moved to Georgia when I was 15. They were 40. And they went to Emory University to get their Master's of Divinity so they could go into deep debt to become really poor Mississippi ministers. So they finished seminary and moved back to Mississippi.
But they were both, obviously people of faith. And when you say they got the calling, was that how did that manifest?
So my dad had been ordained as a Baptist pastor or preacher when he was in his early 20s, but he didn't preach. I mean, the Baptist church is less organized or less regimented than the Methodist church.
Did he get into it as sort of a business endeavor?
No. And that's the thing. Like my dad, he preached his faith. My dad was like one of those young evangelists who really wanted to talk about what God did. And he was involved in the civil rights movement as a teenager. Uh-huh. And so for him, between poverty and civil rights, like those were usually where his messages came together.
Yeah.
My mom was called later in life, but we had grown up in the Baptist church, which said that women, at least the strain of Baptists we were, the missionary Baptist